First of all, I want to say a very good afternoon to our distinguished guests, our excellencies, ambassadors, senior reps from the different countries, 7 countries to be exact. And of course, thank you to our organizers for putting this together at the Civil Service College and also the Temasek Foundation. When I was invited to do this, it didn't take me very long to say yes. As Tina has mentioned, I started off my career as a police officer for 9 years. Actually, in Singapore, there are quite a lot of former police officers who have gone into various sectors, leadership positions, and so on. Benedict Chong, whom you have just heard, the CEO of the Temasek Foundation, was also formerly a police officer, and we kind of knew each other many, many years ago. Then I became an academic researcher, but I also do consulting on a daily basis with the government agencies and so on. So what I want to do is to be able to share with you some of my experiences in Singapore, but this is an opening session, and I wouldn't bother you or bore you with many technical details. In fact, if you look at the program for the next 2 days or so across the different workshops, I think our officials, our friends and colleagues from the different ministries will share with you the different aspects of the Singapore experience. As Benedict aptly put it, I think sharing with you is really an exchange exercise, wanting to share with you the lessons we learned, both the plus and minuses, I think things that we could have done better, and things that we think were able to help us to do an effective job. And then also to learn from each other, not just between Singapore and the 7 countries, obviously, but among the 8 countries, all of us are trying to gain some insights from the others, and then able to adopt, able to adapt. And I think to adapt first before we adopt. I think that's kind of a really important situation. I understand quite about an hour or so with you. I'm definitely not going to spend an hour talking. That would be beyond the normal attention span of most people. As a psychologist, I'm very well aware of our attention span. So what I want to do is to spend maybe the first half to share with you, I think, some of my views. These are personal views. They don't represent, of course, Singapore's views, and I'm not from the public sector. I'm from the university. But at the same time, I think given being a citizen of the country and having worked with agencies for a long time, and also being involved quite directly, not just writing a book, but also going through the experiences in Singapore for the past 1.5 years since COVID kind of hit our shores, I think it is quite useful, right, to take a step back and look at a bigger picture. What then I want to do is to take the first half of the session to share with you my personal views. Hopefully it gives us a kind of not an overview, but kind of a approach, a kind of a mindset, maybe to look at the next few sessions for the participants that you're going through, so that maybe you could equip yourself with questions to ask of our presenters, or the views to share with each other, and then so that we can learn from each other, in order simply to deal with the COVID crisis better, and also to deal with the crisis in general better that we will experience. And then the later half of the session, I'm going to let Tina be the moderator to take over, and so that we can discuss, have some exchange, have some questions. So allow me to look at this quite informally. With no notes, with no slides, because it is really not a lecture, but take it as a kind of a fire chat that we have with each other, learn from each other, and so on. And then in the second half, it could be much more interactive, where I also want to hear from you about your experiences, your comments, and the lessons, and so on. I think when we look at the COVID crisis, as Benedict said, I think we've got to put in perspective. This is a program, or this exchange program or platform is really about crisis governance, right? Of course, the focus, it has to focus on COVID, given our current situation. And moving forward, we all know that COVID is going to stay with us for some time. At the same time, even pre-COVID, during COVID, or post-COVID, if there's such a period of post-COVID, crisis management is going to be important, and so is disaster management. I'm definitely not here to share with you, in the textbook manner of what crisis management is all about. In fact, a brief look at our participants and our distinguished guests actually indicate clearly that many of us here has a vast experiences dealing with crisis, managing disasters, and dealing with your own country's context, which of course differ one from the other. At the same time, I think across countries, across cities, there are also commonalities. So while there are differences, there are also cultural universals because we are all human beings. Another important point to take note is that the interconnectivity of the world that we all live in, right? And so while we are culturally unique and different, appreciating what goes on, I think, in another city, another country is kind of really important because we are really part of this larger globalized world and interconnected systems that we have to deal with. Now, with that, perhaps it's useful to take a step back and ask ourselves, what is crisis governance or crisis management? Now, many of us actually are very familiar with crisis management or disaster management and so on. But I think what COVID has done is to make all of us, which that's why it makes this exchange so important, to make all of us take a step back and ask ourselves very important questions. What are those principles, those things that we know so well about crisis management? What are those things that we need to keep, those things that, because they continue to be so important, but what are those things that we need to tweak? And what are those things that we may need to forego or we need to kind of relook at our paradigms? And what are some of the new things that we need to quickly learn and to quickly kind of internalize or quickly adapt in order for us to understand the role of leadership, the role of adaptability, the role of resilience, and so on. Take a step back again, think about the standard kind of a textbook or our own experiences kind of a crisis management. Now, there are a few kinds of concepts that we're all very familiar with, right? Things like, oh, you must be in command and control as a leader. You must have good communication, make sure it is timely, make sure it is clear, make sure it is fast. Well, when you're speaking, you must have person composure. Well, better still, if you have some charisma that you're able to influence the people that you're speaking with. Being decisive when you make decisions, and also being able to make decisions in the presence of incomplete information or in the absence of complete information. Some of us would also say that experience is so important that at some point it's not about rational thinking. You have to kind of go with your intuition, your judgment, your experiences, and so on. And then you make a fast, coordinated response. And better still, you should have committees, you should have standard operating procedures, right? SOP to put in place. Now, don't get me wrong, I think none of these are wrong. In fact, many of these are going to stay with us, and it is very important in COVID and post-COVID to continue to manage crisis. I just want to, however, say something a little bit different, and that is that if you look at the crisis that you and I think most of us, if not all of us, are used to, they are kind of event-based or incident-based. Right, the kind of crisis that we have actually managed, or even the kind of crisis that we are so-called training, the kind of crisis management skills, tend to talk about events and incidents. So you may talk about, for example, the building just collapsed, or your cities, some parts of it is having a flood, or there are massive fires, there's a hostage situation in a plane, there could be a natural disaster, a volcano just erupted and it has affected all the airplanes, and what do you do? It could be a hurricane, it could be even the tsunami, right, where it actually affected many countries and so on. Well, I think there is a big difference between all these that I've just given you as examples with the kind of a COVID crisis that we are undergoing, right? All the examples that I've given you, while they are certainly serious, they are certainly have a wide range of differences. They do share something in common, and that is they are event-based or incident-based. There is one singular event that kind of sparked the need, the demand for our crisis management skills and responses. And there is a beginning and there is an end, very clearly, right? In terms of whether it's a volcano, it's a flood, or it is in a building collapse kind of a situation. And what that means is that when it is event-based and incident-based, in some sense, it is easier to manage because you see a beginning and end, and you have certain features about this incident, and you are really targeted towards this incident. While you may talk about recovery after the incident and so on, the incident is nevertheless singular. In other words, there is a good starting point, a clear starting point, and a clear ending point. And then after the end, you continue to talk about the event, how you recover from it, talk about resilience and so on. But the event is over, right? Of course, there might be a new event, then you take it as another second crisis, and then you deal with it. But the COVID crisis that we are going through is really quite different. Everybody knows, and we don't have to go through the details, that it's going to be a protracted crisis, that no matter how you look at it, by all estimates, we are already 1.5 years into the crisis. And moving forward, depending on which country, depending on how things goes. Most of us expect that for the next few years, you are still going to be very much within COVID crisis kind of a mode, or crisis kind of a situation. How then we deal with this? Because there is no clear end in sight. In fact, we can talk about a city or a country, right, containing your outbreak and so on. And then you remove your mask, and then you go out and have mass events, and very soon you find that an outbreak happens again, and you still the same virus, or it could be a mutated variants of it, but basically it is still a COVID situation. How do you then deal with it? Now, why this is so important, it means that unlike your singular event-based kind of a crisis situation, we have a time aspect, right? You have to deal with the immediate, the now and then, because people are panicking, people are losing their jobs, people's lives are at stake, and so on. So you have to deal with an immediate situation. But related to this whole COVID crisis, you have a midterm situation that you have to deal with, because with every decision that we make as either policymakers or as in between, the kind of senior public servants, where we make decisions that have a vast impact on the consequences. You have to think about the midterm. In other words, you have to also think about the long term. What happens if the virus is not going to go away? It becomes endemic, right? Endemic is really a biological, epidemiological term to say that the virus kind of remain in the region that we are in, and there will be outbreaks now and then, even though for most of the time we might have it under control. In other words, I think unlike our crisis that we are used to, where they are event-based and incident-based, this crisis has basically, in a very much serious manner, in terms of the whole time continuum, has affected our lives, our livelihood, our way of life, and our quality of life. Right? Come again, these four important aspects: our lives, that's the public health aspects; our livelihood, that's the economic aspects; our way of life, that's every other aspect, how we go about in our daily living; and then your well-being, right, your quality of life. And the crisis is so multidimensional. It is spilling over to social, political domains, psychological domains. Mental health becomes important. It exists at multiple levels. It definitely affects the individuals, but it affects teams and groups. It affects organizations, societies, and so on, in the different sectors of society. And it has multiple linkages, right? Whatever happens here will affect something there. Whatever happens in this system affect another part of the system. So when we are in crisis management, we no longer look at it as a particular incident. We have to take I think all our experiences, we do know that we have to take a systems perspective, by dealing with the entire ecosystem, so to speak, recognizing that whatever we do in one part of the system is going to affect others and another parts, and there are going to be changes over time, that things are so dynamic. So what all this, I think for me at least, right, what it does is that it created great demands. Many of these demands are quite new on our leadership, on the notion of adaptability in terms of our adaptive capacities or adaptive capabilities, and the notion of resilience as well, right? In order to bounce back, just to survive, or to bounce back to thrive, the notion of leadership, adaptability, and resilience become very important, right? Which is kind of like the theme of my talk today. So the crisis management that we talk about, I would suggest that we look at it in terms of a PRR, a prevention and a response and a recovery, right? Like most crisis management, when we understand this COVID in all its multi-dimensionality, that you always have to think about preventing things from happening, bad things, of course. Think about the response itself, and think about the recovery. And then how we see prevention, response, and recovery being grouped together, being coalesced together in a way that we can then function much better. And I will just throw out a few what I think are guiding principles that I observe in the Singapore's experience. I'm sure some of these principles operate in other cities, other countries as well. And this is really from my own personal view, a personal experience, that I think there are 5 principles that are very important. And after that, we can have a discussion in terms of how we're going to approach this COVID to respond to it and to manage it in a much more effective manner. But I think the first guiding principle that Singapore has benefited from is that the leadership, as well as the public sector leaders, from the very beginning, I think what we did was we took an evidence-based approach, right? By evidence, of course, we means really respecting the science of it. Because when we talk about the virus, you are really talking about the scientific issue fundamentally. How does it spread? What does it do? What can you do about safe management in order to prevent it from a further spread? How to contain it, and so on. So understanding the science becomes so important, and I think we are very thankful that the entire world, Singapore included, right, the scientists in a way have stepped up very quickly, able to not only map up the gene or the genome, so to speak, of the vaccines, but able to share a lot of information and able to speed up a lot of publications, sharing of information in a record time, and that has helped a lot. What I think is difficult is when the evidence changes or when more data. I think it is not so easy politically, but it is a must, in my view, that political leaders as well as public service leaders can we actually change your position when you need to in the light of new information that come from scientific evidence. So while I think the decisions that politicians and public service leaders make is always a collection of many sources of information, when it comes to COVID-19, I would expect and I will hope that scientific evidence is going to be one of the primary driving force, right, that will actually lead us, lead everyone towards certain decisions rather than other decisions. So that's the first principle. Can we be evidence-based in what we do, right, in our crisis response? The second principle I would argue that we need to look at is to be risk-based. In other words, when you look at the COVID crisis, because it's protracted, it is not quite possible to treat it as a daily emergency where all decisions that you're going to focus on one particular dimension. Obviously, lives are important, but so is livelihood, so is the way of life that I talk about, and so is the quality of life. And if it's going to be protracted, you need to function. You need to know how to factor in your resources, how to allocate your resources, because something worse might happen down the road. So being able to understand how, with the help of science, of course, how the virus evolve, how things are dynamic, and then how things, as it happens, could have different degree of risk, and people may have different risk appetites. It means that as you make crisis management decisions, like when do you close the border, how much do you close, how much do you open, when do you have very strict measures to restrict movements of people outside the home, when do you test people, and so on. These kind of responses, I would argue that we need to be more calibrated. And I think in the Singapore situation, what the leaders have done is they try a very calibrated approach. Right? Even as I speak now, actually this evolving situation, we are actually right now midway in a 4-week period of a heightened alert, because we had some community, after many months of no community cases, in the past few weeks, we did have a spike in some community cases. So what the government did was to implement a heightened alert phase, right, where you only allow 2 people to be outside the home in a public gathering at any one time. We close down restaurants. We only allow takeaway, and you're not allowed to dine into restaurants or in food courts or hawker centers and so on. So what this does is that it did help us, because the evidence shows that in the past 2 weeks, we seem to be heading in the right direction. The community cases appear to be going down, but it is going down, and it appears to be on the right track. Unlinked cases also has gone down. Unlinked meaning that those cases that are not directly linked with any previously known confirmed COVID case, right? Which is of course a concern, because if it's the more unlinked cases, it means that the virus is in the community silently, quietly circulating. So that has been going down, and we are quite hopeful, at least the government is quite hopeful, that by June 13, which is officially the date that marks the so-called the end of this heightened alert period, if all goes well, we are going to relax some of the restriction. But as the government actually said just yesterday, this relaxation is not going to be, oh, let's go out, take off your mask and gather any number of people you want, right? It's going to be a calibrated one. And I think that kind of a crisis management response is really quite important. Because if you were to go out and celebrate and say, let's take off your mask, you can gather in big masses, events, don't worry about safe management, you could very well waste all the efforts that the entire population has put into, and then you could have outbreaks again. This race-based kind of approach as a principle is also important when it comes to testing, how you test people with the various kinds of tests, how do you isolate people, how do you treat them, how do you roll out your vaccines and so on. But during the discussion, if we have time, we can go a little bit more in detail to hear from each other in our own countries and cities. How do you do your testing? How do you try to roll out your vaccine national program, if you will? And how do you try to make use of different vaccines and make use of different testing protocols and procedures? So evidence-based is an important principle. Risk-based is another important principle. And the third important principle I will want to share with everyone is the need for collaboration, right? A collaboration focus. The whole idea, I think, about this program, which I was very excited when I looked at the program, is that the organizers are bringing together the people from the different agencies to share with all of us in terms of what they do in terms of financing, in terms of managing the crisis on the ground, in terms of public health, in terms of public communications, and so on. Now, every one of us, many of you are here in government, are very familiar with the notion of WOG, right? Whole of government approach. And it is very easy to talk about whole of government and preach about it. It is really quite something to actually implement it. I think one of the lessons that we could learn from each other is how can we do this whole of government approach much better? How can we then work together? And not just WOG, but what about WOS, right? A whole of society approach, because quite obviously, the government, the public sector, you can't just depend on yourself. You need the private sector to come in. You also need the people sector, and you need people as individuals to come together. So the ideal of collaboration, working not just across different disciplines, but working across different sectors becomes important. That, of course, require each of us being experts in our field or being experienced in your own particular department and so on, to take some perspective of each other. Many a times, I always share with my friends and my colleagues and my students that when we see ourselves as experts, the more expert we are, I think the less likely that we are going to admit that we could be wrong. And also the less likely that we are going to question our own assumptions and look at things from the perspective of some other people who might be a novice to your discipline or your area, but is actually an expert in his or her area, which actually comes in very important in trying to solve the real world situation, right? In this case, the COVID crisis, the COVID outbreak. Obviously, the world is not compartmentalized into the various departments of the government or the various disciplines of the way we organize our knowledge. So the humility, I think, to question ourselves, the need to look at perspective from another sector, another agency, another discipline, another expert, I think becomes critical and very important. And that then will allow us to collaborate. Very quickly, I think because of time, and I really want to make sure we have time for some discussion, to talk about the fourth principle that I have in mind, and this is a tough one. It is really about behavioral insights. I think across different societies and countries, we want to really bear in mind that while our contexts are very different, fundamentally, we are all human beings, right? And we all know from the science and behavioral sciences and psychology for the past 20 years, for the past 200 years or so, that there are a lot of commonalities among human beings, right? Even though you live in different cultures. As human beings, we are subjected to certain cognitive biases in the way we process information. As human beings, we tend to be very much reactive when we have negative information as compared to positive information. We react much stronger. It means that our communication becomes very important. It is not like if you say two negative things, you say two positive things, then things become neutral, right? That's because we react simply stronger to negative things. We also need to understand how the public or how different people have different expectations. We also need to understand the notion of trust, right? What is trust? What is public trust? How do we ensure the trust in government, the trust in the different experts continue to be maintained? Because once you erode that trust, it becomes very, very difficult to operate, even though you may have your resources, even though you may make a right decision, so to speak. And of course, when you talk about trust, it is not just about between the people and the government. It is also about trust between different groups in the country or in in a city. It's about your social harmony. It is about making sure that people of different races, people of different religions or their different practices, or the people who come from different social economic classes, you want to make sure that the trust between these groups, this intergroup trust is maintained. Because once that intergroup trust is not maintained, I think when you try to deal with a crisis, you can have a fallout, right, between groups, and that makes our work extremely difficult. So the challenge is, how do you develop that social capital, that psychological capital, to make sure that when bad things happen, our people continue to be adaptive, continue to be resilient, and so on. And that leads me, I think, to the final principle that I'll share before I open it up for discussion and questions and comments. I think the final principle that we might want to use to guide our emergency and our crisis management response is what I call a future orientation. This is the idea that comes from really the idea that the pandemic is going to be endemic, right? In other words, it's going to stay with us, perhaps just like the common flu. It really means that a lot of things, our way of life have to change. It also means that we might have to take a vaccine booster jab, not just a third time after the first two for most of the vaccines, but perhaps you have to take it annually. What does that mean for your safe management that are in place right now? Do we have to forever wear masks for the rest of our times? Do we have to not have mass events? That would be very difficult, right? But in order to have that, then how do we adopt a very future-oriented approach and ask ourselves, what are the really negative things that we need to prevent? What are the very positive things that we must continue to promote and continue to aspire? So a kind of a future orientation mindset where we think about the positive that we want to aspire to, and we also think about the negative that we want to and we must prevent, will then guide us to say, how do we continue to operate, right, in a way that is sustained or in a way that is sustainable? Then that can in turn drive us in terms of the kinds of resources that we need, be it financial, be it manpower, be it systems, and so on. It will also affect how we develop our capabilities, and perhaps most of all, how we develop our mindsets, right? The mindsets that we have to prepare our leaders ourselves, to prepare our senior public sector leaders, as well as preparing the population, right, the public at large, the different segments, so that communication becomes important, public education becomes important, and working together becomes so important. And that requires the ability to think about the future in a very systematic way. We will never be sure what the future is, but if we can plan for plausible scenarios, probable scenarios, I think that will make a world of difference. Right, I think so. With that, I would like to take a pause, and I think I'm going to hand back to Tina as we think about the principles that, if I could just repeat, right, things about the principles that could guide us in our management of a crisis and in the way we respond. Right, think about evidence-based, think about being risk-based, think about collaboration focus, think about the behavioral insights that we need to quickly pick up and understand and apply, and think about a future orientation, right, in terms of our systems, in terms of our mindset. And if we can use some of these guiding principles in the way we approach our own situation back home in our own country, and if we can take this kind of principles and try to discuss as the participants go through this 2 days or so workshop, I hope that we can then make a positive difference when we all go back home and go back to try to manage the crisis in a much more effective way. Because the crisis is going to stay with us, I think, for a long time. And we just simply need to operate, but we need to operate better with the hope that we can emerge stronger and not just merely survive, but also to thrive. Right. Thank you very much. Tina, if you are there, can I hand over the session back to you?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Chan.